Hi, everyone. My name's Connor. Thanks very much for coming to this room. I'm going to spend the next 40 minutes or so talking to you about building apps with Facebook for mobile web. So let's get started. I want to show you a quote from Mark last year that will frame this a little bit better. So I'm going to give you a sec to read that. So what he's actually saying there is that we bet too much on HTML5. And this was last year before we launched the native versions of our apps that were faster and better. So when you read that, you might be forgiven for thinking, Facebook's leaving mobile web behind. We don't really care so much about Facebook. But actually, the opposite is actually true. I want to show you the second half of this quote that most people forget. I'll let you read that. Here's the bit that's important. More people on a daily basis use Facebook for the mobile web than on our native iOS and Android apps combined. Think about what that means. That's an incredible stat, right? We have 750 million people using Facebook on mobile. And over half of those people are using Facebook on a browser, on their mobile device. Not on iOS native, not on Android native, but in a browser. So if you're building a mobile web experience and you want to put Facebook in that, that's your audience, right? If you haven't got a mobile web app, just a desktop app and native apps, then you're ignoring over half of our mobile users. So who's doing this already? Here's a couple of examples. SoundCloud have such a good mobile web experience that they send most of their users here first before they even go to the native apps. Airbnb, again, have a native app and a web app that are pretty much comparable. They have the exact same experience on both. They do a really good job of it. And then there's websites like The Guardian and Huffington Post that are building a mobile web experience that rivals their native browsers, that has sharing features enabled, login features that get their users in and using their mobile web apps. And then apps like Pinterest and Quora have integrated the experience so well that when you log into them, you feel like you've already been using the app for quite some time because they do such a good job of pulling in your Facebook information as a user that you feel familiar with the app from the second you log in. So here's an example of how this works. I create a sound on SoundCloud, and I put it up. And that publishes back to Facebook. And then Bear sees that, and she's got Facebook on her device. So she sees that on the Facebook app and goes to the SoundCloud app, and she can listen to my mix that I've put up. But Simon's just using Facebook on his browser. So if SoundCloud didn't have a mobile web experience, he wouldn't see that content. Luckily, SoundCloud do. So Simon sees the exact same content through his browser. So that's how that works. That's the why. Let's look at how this is done. I just want a quick show of hands in the room. How many people have actually used Facebook SDKs for web or mobile web already? OK, brilliant. That's a pretty good turnout. How many people have a native app but not a mobile web app? Some of you. Great. OK. So that gives me an idea of what the room's like. For those of you that have done some integration with the JavaScript SDK before, or the PHP SDK, or some of the third-party SDKs, hopefully there will be some content in here that will help you get the most out of them. So if you've never built an app before, first thing you have to do is register your app with Facebook. You get an app ID, you give it a name, and you fill in the basic details. So this is like your root domain and your website with Facebook login. And then you add your app URL to the website with Facebook login section, and you're good to go. Now you've got an app ID that you can use with our SDKs. If you've already got a mobile or a desktop app, then you just use the same app ID. And so many people forget this. They think, oh, I've got a native app, I've got a website, well, I'll just use different app IDs because that's what seems like the right thing to do. I'll show you throughout this talk why you should share the same app ID across both. And here's a way to think about it, right? Your app ID actually becomes the key to accessing the Facebook APIs across all your experiences for all your users on iOS native, Android native, desktop web, and mobile web. All right, so you've got your app ID. Let's start doing some Facebook integration. We provide SDKs for both JavaScript and PHP on the web. But if you're building in Node, Ruby, Python, or one of the other back-end languages, you can use some of the third-party SDKs we've provided. There's ones for Node.js, the Node SDK, Koala for Ruby, and then Python for Facebook. These are all third-party, but they work really well, and they've pretty much feature parity with our PHP and JavaScript SDKs. Most of the integration that you're going to do is on the client side. So most of the experiences you'll build will be on the client side. So we'll talk about the JavaScript SDK today for most. So loading the SDK is pretty simple. You get this script file, which does an asynchronous load of the SDK file. You initialize that with your app ID and some configuration settings, depending on your app. And then you're good to go. You've got the SDK already in your app and ready to start using. So at that point, what can you do? Well, start with the really basics. I think this is something worth reminding about. I mean, a lot of people have seen social plugins before. You've seen the like button and the comments plugin. They've been around for some time. But so many people forget to put these in their mobile web experience that they're just like leaving users on the table that aren't able to interact with your app. So both of these work really, really well on mobile web as well as desktop web. And they're just one line of code to integrate. They're so simple that you should just do them anyway. So one-liner, when your SDK is initialized, it'll turn that into a like button. And same with the comments plugin. When your SDK is initialized, that just turns it into a comments plugin that renders within the UI of your mobile web app. And it works just as well on desktop and mobile. So next up, what about if you want to share some content from your app? Like not just a like button, but you've got content inside your app and you want to share that out. The feed dialog does this really, really well. So both iOS and Android browsers have their own mechanism for this. On Android, it's the share intent. On iOS, it's what we call a share sheet, which is a feature of iOS 6. And they're good. They're a good start for getting content from your app into your users' news feeds. But a feed dialog is actually a much better way to do this. And I'll show you why. Because with a feed dialog, you can get users that will share content directly into your app that has details about where it came from, specifically which app it was shared with. And also, as a developer, you get more control over how that looks. So here's an example, right? This is me on The Guardian using the iOS native share to put some content onto my timeline so my friends can see it. I use the share sheet, which is default built into iOS 6. And I type really slowly, because I'm not a good typer. Right. And that's put some content in there. And you can see that it's created a story that my friends can see, and they can click on that. And that's a good start, right? But there's some problems with it. For a start, it says via iOS. That's not very interesting, right? Users don't know that this came from the Guardian's app. And what's worse is you can't see this here, but actually the URL that it goes to is m.guardian.co.uk. So what happens when Bear looks at this and she's on her desktop? She's going to go to the mobile side, and that's not a great experience. So let's do it again, but this time the Guardian have provided the feed dialog. So now I click on it. It pops up. This is our SDK user interface now. And when I post, it's a much more interesting story. For a start, the Guardian has control over the URL that they publish, and in this case, they're publishing to www.guardian.co.uk, and then whatever the slug is for their story. And then also, it's app attributed. So you can see that this comes from the Guardian. So straight away, they're going to get analytics about what users are sharing. But more importantly, if they want to turn on deep linking and build a native app at some point in the future, then this story will go straight through to their site, or straight through to their app, or to the App Store so that users can install it. Right. I'll give you a quick example of that. So I have a really, really basic example here. I've implemented the SDK. The SDK is ready. And I'm just going to click this button, which will post to my feed. Pops up here, and I can type in some stuff, and I can hit post. I won't do it there. But when that posts, it'll actually say that it comes from the app. And in this case, this is an app that I just created as an example. Well, I'll post it. OK, so now it's published. And when I look at that on my timeline, that's not me. OK, so this time it's come from this app. And I've had control over the URL, the picture that gets attached to it, and the app that it's attributed to. It's much more useful than using the share intent. If I was to do that using the simulator, it would look exact same, except that in this case, the view is just optimized for mobile. So it's the exact same. Now when I share, it's the exact same view, but this time it's optimized so that it fits inside the mobile browser. The post is published, and I'm back to my page. All right, so that's feed dialog. What about if you want to get more details about the user? If I go back to the slides, we can talk about the next most important thing, logging in with Facebook. So at this stage, you've got users interacting with your app. They can share content back to timeline, but your app doesn't know anything about them. So when they land inside your app, they don't really have anything personalized. So you don't know who they are. They don't get an experience that's personalized. So what you want to do is build an experience that lets the user feel like they're a part of the app, so that when they come to your app, they log in with Facebook, and it has their personal data. This is really important on mobile, more so than on desktop, because when users are out and about and they're using your app on a mobile phone, the last thing they want to do is type in a username and a password, remember different passwords. They want to hit one button and be into your app straight away, because they're probably on a bus, or they're walking somewhere, or they're busy, and they've got a touch screen where it's a bad keyboard experience. They just want to hit a button and be in your app. So if you have any barriers to that, then you're losing users. Facebook provides the solution for that, because most of the time, your users will be logged in with the Facebook browser anyway, and you'll just get them logged into your app. So I want to explain the flow of the JavaScript SDK, because if you guys have used the SDK before but not really looked into detail on the flow, it can be a little bit confusing. So here's how it looks, right? The SDK loads, and it does a call to this method, window.fb async init. And that actually does a call to fb.init, which is where you've set up some configurable settings for the SDK. Now, one of those settings is really important. It's just status, and you set that either to true or false. If it's set to true, then what the SDK will try to do is initialize that FB object, but with a user session in place. So I'll show you what happens. If you've got status false, then your SDK is ready, but you don't have a session. If you set status to true, then what the SDK is going to try and do is connect to our OAuth endpoint, figure out if you're an authorized user, and then hopefully log you into the app. Now, if you've never granted that app permission before, then that'll come back false, and your SDK will be initialized, but you won't have a user. If the user is authorized, then at that point, you've got a ready session, a logged-in user that is already ready to start interacting with the APIs and get customized information inside the app. So this is where we're at, right? We've either got a session or we don't. When you call fb.getLogin status on an unauthorized session, you'll get back this status that says not authorized. Not authorized is a really interesting state. And I'm going to show this in a demo in a second, right? But what happens is, if the user has never granted permission to your app, it'll say status unknown. But if the user's logged into Facebook but hasn't granted permission to your app, it'll say status not authorized. So you can use that to your advantage. You know that that user might not have used Facebook with your app before, but they are logged into Facebook, right? The SDK gives you that as a clue. So you should use that to your advantage. You should create a prompt, a really clear prompt that says log in with Facebook, because you know that person's already logged into Facebook. They just haven't logged into your app yet. And at that point, once the prompt's there, then hopefully that user will take that prompt and log into your app with Facebook instead of creating a username and password. If the SDK is ready with the session, then you're good to go. You can already start calling the API and getting some of those custom features. So you can show a greeting, for example, that says hi Connor, right? Just using one API call to /me. So I'm going to demo that really quickly just to show you how it works. Right. So this is my login example. By the way, quick note on this. I'm not here to demo UI or CSS. So this is deliberately ugly because it keeps the source code really, really basic. I'm going to show you what this does, right? Really simple stuff. It's a login method here and the async init code that sets up the app with status true. Then it does a check on get login status to find out the status of whether I'm logged into this app or not. So when I run this, you can see what I get back here is just this object, which is an auth response, and a status not authorized. Now, just to show you what this means, if I do the same thing from within an incognito Chrome browser, which means at this point I'm not logged into Facebook. So not logged into Facebook, there's no Facebook session, and I try to do the same thing, it comes back with status unknown. So that not authorized status is really useful for you. You can use that to your advantage, and you can get your user logged in with a Facebook prompt saying log in with Facebook. I'll skip back to the slides and show you some more of this. Right. I showed this step earlier, and I breezed over it, right? This step's actually quite important as well. What it means is that when the SDK hits the OAuth endpoint, it will find out whether your user has logged into the app before and is logged into Facebook. If they've never granted permission to your app, then when they try to log in, you're going to get prompted to say that like this app would like access to your basic information. We call that the permissions dialog. But if the user has already used your app on a native device or on desktop, then it'll actually bypass this step, and you'll get your user logged in automatically. So say, for example, you've got a mobile app out there or a desktop app, but you haven't built a mobile web app. If you use the same app ID and initialize the SDK in this way, then when the user goes to your mobile web app, they'll just be logged in immediately. They'll never have to see that like login with Facebook prompt. We call this auto login, and it's incredible how many people should do this and don't. Now, just to show you this, I'm going to just do one more quick demo. So I'm using my same login example, right? As a user, I've never authenticated this app, but I'm going to hit the same URL on my phone. So I've got this on my phone, and this time I'm going to hit the log me in button, and it's going to prompt to say, would you like to let this app access your basic permissions? I'm going to say yes. So I've actually authorized this app, but on my phone, not on my desktop. Watch what happens next. I refresh this page, right, without clicking on the login button. Boom. This time it's status connected, right? So I didn't do anything on my desktop, but I'm logged in, because the SDK knows that I've already granted this app permissions. That's a really, really useful feature. And a lot of web apps are doing this already. Airbnb do it really well. Deezer do it really well. But lots of people aren't doing this, and they should. OK, back to the slides. So that's auto login. And there's a reason why this is actually really useful as well. I want to just explain it with this diagram. So say I'm using a web app on my mobile device, and it uses a cookie to authenticate me. But maybe I don't use that app very often, right? So I come to the app, I log in, there's a cookie that's going to have a certain period of time that it lasts, right? And then I go off and I browse a bunch of other things, or I'm using apps, or whatever I'm doing, and my cookie expires. So the next time I go to hit the app, I have to authenticate again, and I have to log in again. And that's a pretty sucky experience. But we'll do the same thing with auto login. So I log into Facebook, right? And I'm probably logged into Facebook by the time I log into the app. So it's able to authenticate me using the Facebook cookie. Then I'm browsing around, and each time I hit Facebook, because I'm addicted to Facebook, I'm on it all the time, it extends that cookie and refreshes the cookie. So it's probably not going to be expired by the time I come to hit your app again. So that means that there's already a Facebook cookie in there, and it logs you back in without that prompt. That's the benefit of auto login. OK, I've done the demo, so I'll skip that. OK, so that's all on the client side so far. We've authenticated the user on the client side, but you're probably going to build an experience that's got a server-side component to it as well. So how do you share that session? The good news is that it's automatically supported in our PHP SDK through the cookie parameter. When you set the cookie true in the FB init on the JavaScript side, it'll pass that cookie back to the PHP SDK, which will just handle that transparently. So that means you're logged in on both the client and the server. It is worth pointing out that this is not a state management solution. You should use this to get information about the user, but then you should manage the state for that user yourself so that they're logged into the server and the client in sync. Right. So let's say you've already got an auth flow. You've already built an app. It's got a mobile web app version or a desktop web app version, and you've got basically a username and password field with a database at the back end with the username and password store. You've used email address as a username, and users are typing in, logging in with the email address. So now you want to add Facebook to that. So now you've got a flow where you've got sign in using Facebook, but users can choose to sign in with their email address and password. What happens when somebody that's already logged into your app? Sorry, what happens when you've got a new user, right? So a new user will come along and sign in using Facebook first. And then you'll get information about that user, including their Facebook user ID. And then you'll be able to get the API method to find out more information about them, like their name, their email address, and you'll store that in your database. But it might be that this user has logged into your app, not using Facebook, but using the username and password fields that you've got. And so now you've got a situation where a user might end up with 2 accounts inside your app. So the way to fix this is you let them sign in with Facebook, you get their user ID, and you use that to do a /me call to find out more about them, get their email address, and check that against any email addresses that you've already got in your database. When you find one that matches, you merge those 2 records. So now that user has both an FB user ID and an email address and password field. So that's a single account at that point because you've merged them. But some users have actually got an email address registered to Facebook, but maybe they use a different email address when logging into apps. So how do you merge them? Well, in this case, let's say a user has logged in using their existing email address and password flow. At that point, you can use the get login status that I showed you earlier to find out whether that user is also logged into Facebook. If they are, you prompt them to add their Facebook account to their account inside your app. And at that point, you know who the user is, and you can then choose to figure out which email address you use as the canonical record for that user. You can either disable one account, or you can merge both and use one email address as the primary address. Right, so what else can you do with the API? Obviously, reading from the Graph API is pretty important. When you use the API in the SDK, all of your calls are asynchronous. You make a call to fb.api once you've authenticated that user. That'll call an asynchronous method that you provide that'll be your callback. That'll get a JSON object, and you just handle that inside your app whatever way you want. Now, I'll not go into too much detail on this today because the other talks have covered Graph API in pretty decent detail. But it is worth pointing out that all of the features that you can get with the Graph API in the iOS and Android native SDKs are the exact same as what you'll get in the JS SDK. You just use the fb.api method and pass in whatever the Graph API URL is. So there's an example, right? I'm doing fb.api on me. I pass in the callback function, which is anonymous. And all this does is just going to alert with my name. So there's a very simple example. It's worth pointing out that you can only get back data that you've asked for permission to get. So when your user authenticates to your app, they authenticate with very specific permission about the kind of information you can get back. So with the basic user information, without asking for any additional scope, they can get back really simple stuff like your name, where you are, gender, things that are public to that user, so that whatever's on their timeline publicly, that's what you'll get back from that call. So if you want to extend that and get more information about them, for example, email, you actually have to do another login call using fb.login, and then pass in the scope of the extra permissions that you want. So I'll show that with the Graph API Explorer. Does anybody here not know what the Graph API Explorer is? Wow, that's actually really good. OK, I'll just do a quick example. So I'm going to get back basic information about me using this example that I've given. So I've only granted it permission to the most basic information so far. So when I try and get email address, for example, that's just more or less an empty array, right? It doesn't have my email field in there. It's just got my ID. And that's because I actually haven't granted this app permission yet. So this time I'm going to grant the permission. Whoops. Thank you. So now it's able to get my email address that I've stored on Facebook. So why this is important is if you need to get information about a user inside your mobile web app, you need to think about the kind of things that you're going to ask for up front. If you don't get that information back in the call to the API method, then you need to handle that in some way that prompts the user to ask them for that extra permissions to get at that data. Also, when you're building your mobile web experience, you want to think about the most basic amount of information that you need to ask from your user to build a good experience. So don't ask for a ton of different things that aren't really relevant, or else your user won't grant permission, and you won't be able to customize that experience for them. OK, back to the slides. So that's reading information. Publishing OG stories with the mobile web SDK is really, really simple as well. I'm not going to talk about that because it is also just using call to fb.api, exactly the same as getting from the API. What I will talk about is the kind of things you need to do to set up your objects inside your mobile web app. So hopefully you've seen from the other talks how to set up Open Graph at the minute, how to describe the objects inside your app, and then how to publish actions against them to create interesting stories. To set up your objects, you set up metadata that describes what the objects are. Now, in a mobile web app, most of your objects will probably be public. This means that users can find them in a URL by going directly to them. But you can also use the Object API if you need to build private or user-owned objects inside of your mobile web app. So this is brand new, and we talk about it a lot today in the native talks. But this is completely available to you inside your mobile web app as well. So when you set up your object, you have to think about where you want to put this metadata. So for example, right, let's say that I've got two versions of my app, a mobile at m. and a desktop version at www. whatever my example app is .com. There's some neat tricks you can do to put the metadata for your objects in the right place to improve their performance. So first up, let's say you've got a lot of metadata inside of your inside of the head for your desktop version of the app, but you don't want to put that in your mobile app because it's a load of extra markup that's going to make the download of your pages slow. The quickest thing you can do to fix that is to use this rather underused field, link rel equals canonical. And what that does is it'll actually point our scraper to the www version of your app's object to get the metadata from there. So when you deliver the m. you don't have to deliver all that metadata as well. You just have a single extra field, rel equals canonical, and that will point our scraper to your desktop version of the app. So the Guardian does this pretty well. I'll show you. So when I go to the mobile version of the Guardian and pick some random story, looking at the page source of this, oh, this is really small, so I'll make this bigger. So when I look for some of the OG fields, like OG title, it doesn't actually have it, right? It's not in the M version of this site. But what they do have, they've got this link rel equals canonical, which points to the www version of this story on the Guardian. So when I go there, you can see that this page actually has all the metadata. So what this means is that their mobile version doesn't have loads of extra markup to describe the object. It's all just stored in the www version. And this keeps their page load a little bit quicker and makes it easier to code for their M site. But what happens if you've got a responsive design? Let's go back to the slides, and I'll describe that too. If you've got a responsive design that serves the same markup for both your desktop and mobile versions of your site, then you can actually do a point out using this OG metadata field to get extra metadata about your app from a separate HTML file that doesn't include these extra parameters in the head of your object. So this works really well if you're a music app or a recipe app or something that has a lot of hierarchical data with a lot of the extra metadata in it. So you put the basic ones inside your page, like the title, the URL, the image, and then all the extra things that describe your object in more detail, like music artist or recipe, ingredients, all these extra metadata fields, they can go on a separate page that just serves the metadata. And you can point to it using the OG metadata field. Again, this keeps the markup for your page down and keeps the responsiveness up. So I mentioned it before about permissions when you're getting data from the API. It's the exact same when you're writing. If you're building an experience that publishes actions when your users do things inside your mobile web app, you need to make sure that the user has granted permissions to publish these actions in the first place. So you need to look for the publish action permission in order to be able to do these publishes. Now, there's two different ways that you can do this. You can either, when your user logs in, you can do a call to me/permissions to find out what that user's already granted your app and check if they've got the rights to publish actions. And at that point, you can build your mobile web app in such a way that it just publishes automatically and provides like UI for sharing and for publishing actions. Or you can actually do this at the point where you go to publish. So if it's a music app and you hit play, you can try and do the publish and then handle whenever the API fails and says, like, no, actually your user hasn't granted permission for this. You can handle that in such a way that you then prompt the user and ask them for permission to do so. So you need to think about the right way to do this for your app. The reason this is important is because each one of these relies on an API call. And either you're going to do an extra fetch when the user logs in, which will slow down the login experience, but it'll mean that you know about that user and what their permissions are. Or you'll actually try and publish these stories whenever the user's using your app, and then you'll handle that yourself to upsell the user to get permissions whenever it fails. So it's up to you. It depends which version of that experience you want to build for your users. I'll skip through both of these because they're basically the same as what you've seen in the other talks. They're demos about publishing from the API Explorer. But what I will show you is what happens when you try to publish an action that you haven't granted permission for. So here's an app that I built before. It's got some open graph actions, so you can do some fun stuff. And I'm going to try and publish one of these actions. That's not a very interesting one. Let's do a more interesting one. Yeah, that's better. OK, so this worked fine, right? But whenever I remove the permissions, you'll see the difference in what comes back. Right, so I'm trying to do the same thing, but at this point, I actually don't have permission to do so. So you see what happens here? You get this OAuth exception error. That's what you'll need to be looking for if you're building an open graph experience inside your web app and you haven't checked if you've got permissions. So that's what comes up, and you need to handle that inside your app and figure out how that relates to your app's experience. OK, go back to the slides. So we did that. So again, publishing actions is just as simple as it is to get actions, to get data back from the API. So at this point, you're just using fb.api. The only difference is that you send back a method post to say that you're actually posting to this endpoint instead of getting data back from this endpoint. And again, this is an asynchronous call, and you handle the response in a callback function. So it's the exact same. I'll skip over that demo as well. So I want to talk just briefly about optimizing client-side performance. The first one that you can do here to optimize your client-side performance is you want to use a channel file. A lot of people forget to put a channel file in when they're initializing the SDK. And all this does is a simple, like, one-line pointer to the script that downloads when you download the SDK. The reason this is important is because not all mobile web browsers support cross-domain downloading. So the reason that this is here is just to get around that problem of like fetching something from another domain. And the reason this is important for optimization is because in your mobile web app, caching is really important. And the last thing you want to do is do multiple fetches whenever your web app loads. Because each time you do that, the browser is going to be turning off and on the radio, doing extra HTTP requests, and that just slows down your mobile web app. So you want to put a channel file in there that has proper caching headers so that each time a user hits your app, it's not downloading that channel file again. So many people forget to do this, and it actually just adds extra incremental hits each time the user loads your page. So set your caching headers correctly, set your caching control strategy, and make sure that that page expires after a really long time, and that will improve the performance. Secondly, whenever you're doing requests from the API and building these up and getting lots of information about the user, you want to batch these so that they're faster. So you can do a call to me, and then me/friends to get my friends, and then you can do me/likes to find out what I like, and then you can do me places or photos or whatever, right? But actually, each time you do that, that's a separate HTTP hit, and it just slows down the experience. So you want to combine these into a single HTTP request that even though their data that comes back is bigger, it's only one request, so it's much, much quicker. And it means you're not turning off and on the radio on the mobile device to get back different fetches. Then on top of that, whenever you want to get really complex queries, you can use field expansion to build a query up that's a single HTTP call that gets back all the information that you need in a single hit. So for example here, I'm doing information about me. I'm getting my birthday, my friends, only 10 of those at a time. And then I'm getting their pictures. And then I'm getting my likes and my picture as well. So that's a single call that gets back a bunch of different information that traverses the graph in a single hit. So I'll skip the demo on that as well, because I think we're a bit pressed for time. But I want to talk about one more thing here. To improve the performance as well, you've got like information that comes from Facebook, and then you've got information that you'll serve from your server. So a standard client-side approach to this is as follows, right? The user adds some things to Facebook, their details about their birthday, their check-ins, their photos. And then when they hit your site, they'll get back HTML from your server, and then there'll be an API call that gets the customization information about the user. And that's client-side fetching. And it's great, but it means that you've got separate HTTP requests to both your server and then the Facebook APIs. If you're really worried about performance and you want to make this faster for your users, you can actually use what we call a real-time API. Now, here's how that works. Again, your users are adding things to Facebook, their photos, check-ins, all that information. And when they add it to Facebook, Facebook actually can send a real-time ping to your server to tell your server that there's some new information there. Then your server does a fetch from the API to get that and store it for your user. That means that you've cached it so that whenever the server hits your app, your server can send back just HTML that has like pre-rendered information about the user that was cached on your server. So this really improves the performance. And it means that the data is always up to date, and your server doesn't have to keep fetching it on a cron job or a daily basis to keep that data up to date. It's always up to date because the real-time API will just let your server know when there's fresh data. OK, so to wrap up, I want to remind you about this slide, right? We have over 751 mobile monthly active users, and over half of those use Facebook for the mobile web. They're using Facebook in a browser. They want to use your app in a browser too. So if you don't have a mobile web experience yet, make one today. And your app is the gateway to the Facebook experience on iOS, Android, desktop web, and mobile web. Simon's doing a talk on going cross-platform. I think he's done that earlier, so he's giving you more detail on this. But if you haven't got a mobile web version of your app yet, then get started straight away. If you want to find out more, all of the API code, all of the docs are on developers.facebook.com/web. we're active in Stack Overflow, so we have a channel there where we talk on Stack Overflow and respond to your questions. And there's already an existing community of people that know pretty well how to use our SDKs. So go on there if you've got questions, and hopefully somebody from Facebook or from the developer community will be able to answer your questions. And then finally, we're putting up all of our web examples on GitHub as well at github/fbsamples. All right, that's us done. I'm not sure what time we have for questions. No time at all. I'm sorry, guys. We have no time for questions. I'm going to be here until 8 o'clock, so please come find me if you've got any specific JavaScript questions, SDK questions. And Jackson's doing a talk later on improving performance in Facebook.com for the mobile web. That'll be an interesting talk if you're interested in this too. Thanks.
Nice job. Thank you, Connor. So in this room with Jackson, we'll be understanding how we made our M site at Facebook run even faster. And in the next room over, we'll be understanding how we built our iOS app with Alan. We'll be starting in about 10 minutes. Thanks.